How's it going, guys? Welcome to 4MR Ranch. So we are revisiting the still very new, very relevant LASERSPEED M6TR. If you have not seen my dedicated review, I highly recommend you do that. I'm going to get more into the nitty-gritty, the specs, the features of this unit. This video is a follow-up, which I feel like I'm going to start doing more often when it comes to devices of this nature, and that is a torture test. There are people that quite literally are counting their life on devices like this. So when you stumble across channels like myself or other channels, if they're not being genuine on the data that they put out, that's a huge problem, because there could be someone counting their life on the information that I'm putting out. So with that being said, we are here to beat up the M6TR, and I'm going to take you along the ride on what I did to quantify its performance. Now, on that regard, what I like to look at, this is my personal way of doing these laser videos, guys, is I will pattern the laser diodes when it's brand new out of the box. So I will mark where the visible laser and the IR laser are at 10 yards, so it's easy to calculate if there is any kind of offset or drifting there right out of the box. And then I run it through a series of tests and see if that diode alignment remains the same. Why is that important? Well, it tells me that the components inside are not shifting, that they're holding true to one another. Because as you'll see when we get to the drop test, sometimes I can physically move the unit, and so that's not really a good metric of seeing what's going on inside, and I like to pattern the diodes. So I already kind of spoiled it there. The first test we put this thing through was the drop test. So not one, but 2 drops. Now I establish a baseline, 0 that is, and just kind of confirm we're on paper, because I'm kind of curious to see, will it actually physically stay put on a rail section. Now by rail section this time, I mounted it directly to the receiver. It was not mounted to a handguard, based on your feedback, because that is a non-movable part of a firearm, typically at least, and it gave us a better mounting point. So that's what I did. I dropped it from shoulder height onto very, very hardly packed asphalt. So a very, very hard hit, and lo and behold, there was a little bit of a shift. Now, I don't want you to think that means that's a failure. When something hits that hard, it's probably gonna move on the rail. Now, speaking of, I did torque it down to 40 inch-pounds. I incorrectly remembered what the torque spec was. It was supposed to be 26 to 30, my bad. So it was over torqued just a little bit. What I then did, unfortunately, is repeated the test, the same procedure, re-zeroed it, but I cranked it up to 50 inch-pounds. So I am now roughly double the mounting torque. Did that screw up results? I don't know. There's a chance that it was so clamped down that that's gonna, open the door for a little bit of teetering, but nonetheless, repeated the test and got even worse shift. So again, I don't want you to think that means it's a failure, because really I wanna see if I can move these diodes inside the unit. If you drop any laser, maybe I shouldn't say any, because there may be some that'll pass a drop test where 0 is maintained. There's a good chance you're gonna have to just realign it. But what matters to me is that if these diodes stay the same relative to each other inside the housing, that means this thing is built pretty well, and you just gotta quickly readjust for where it's now physically been forced to shift ever so slightly on your rail. Now, one thing I also want to point out for those that are still not impressed by how this thing did, first of all, the only damage on this is actually just the mounting post for the rubber illuminator and laser covers. It just physically bent. So I left it as is to show you that. Also, the battery cover is ever so slightly, the battery housing portion is ever so slightly bent inwards from probably where it impacted directly on a piece of that asphalt, the gravel. Otherwise, some scuffs, some nicks, no issues thereafter, but I want to prove it, right? So we took it back and we patterned where the diodes were relative to each other after both those drops, and they were in the exact same positioning as it was right out of the box. So far, so good. Now the next thing I wanted to do is pour water on it, because I have done that to lasers in the past. So I just take a water bottle, pour it directly on the switch, the turrets, the adjustments in the back, everything gets hit, nothing is really spared. This is to simulate, rain. Obviously, this is a lot more targeted than sporadic rainfall would be. But again, I'm trying to be conservative. Now, I didn't submerge this one. I think if you are someone who needs to go diving and swimming to deep depths with a laser, I probably don't recommend lasers in this price point. Unfortunately, I think you're gonna need to spend a little bit more. And So far, this laser hasn't given me any reasons to believe that, but I'm just saying, guys, like, this is really, this is kind of a lower end in terms of price point laser offering. So I don't think Navy SEALs are going to be using LASERSPEEDs. Therefore, I didn't test it for use of someone, you know, an operator of that tier. So the water bottle test is what I felt was sufficient. I've made other lasers fail doing that water bottle test, and there was 0 signs of moisture coming inside this thing. Switches are all functional, to include the crane port. So everything is good to go, and we'll get through more tests, but this is kind of spoiler alert here too, that everything's working no matter what I put it through, that we will continue walking you through. So everything's good to go there, no moisture. How did I verify that? Well, visually, but also what I did is, and I'm gonna roll some footage here for you, the illuminator, if there was moisture, it's gonna get a lot more hazy. It looks the same as it did when it came out of the box. So this is the illuminator after all the testing, and it is absolutely spotless. I mean, just minty clean after all the use and abuse. And if there was water that would have penetrated, you would see that in this illuminator, but you don't. Now, the little bit of spill was present on the unit new, so that's just an artifact, but this looks really good. The laser pointer itself, would there be moisture, this would not be a super fine circle. It would be diffused like there's a diffuser. So virtually no moisture got inside. Everything looks exactly as it did when it was brand new. Obviously after the exterior physically dried. Let's be realistic here, guys. Okay, so we got the drop covered, and water seems to be good to go with the way I tested it. So next I wanted to test it thermally. So the first thing I did is I threw it in the freezer, and I made sure to get it below freezing. When I got the housing to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, I pulled it out of the freezer and mounted it onto my test bench, and once again repatterned the lasers relative to each other to see if there's some material shifting, whatever epoxies, etc. they're using inside the housing, will it shift or not? Well, this one held absolutely perfect once again. Now, there have been lasers that I've tested in the past that had shift at different temperatures. They did return back to room temperature, but this one did not shift at the extreme temperature range of, I'm gonna call it extreme, I live in South Texas, 18 degrees Fahrenheit. There was virtually no shift. There was still frost on the unit as I'm conducting the test. Good to go in cold environment at that temperature. So far so good. But now, what if, again, in the scenario I talked about earlier, let's say you are a law enforcement officer, you got to leave your rifle secured in the in your squad car, or you leave your laser, even as a civilian, locked up in a hot vehicle. It's a summer day, and it gets pretty hot, right? So I threw this in my oven at 175 degrees, and I let it sit there for about 30 minutes, let it get nice and steady state. So I did this test twice, because the first time I tried to record this when I'm patterning these lasers to share with you guys with the psionics, and the battery was dead. So by the time I found a fresh battery, got a charge going, the laser had cooled to 126 degrees Fahrenheit. In that test, even getting up to that elevated temperature, going down to 126, no shift to the laser, but I felt like I was doing you guys an injustice, so I repeated it again with a fresh battery on hand for that psionics recorder to again prove the data that I'm collecting or claiming to collect for you guys. Got it back up to 177 degrees as measured on the exterior of the body, immediately mounted it. And at the time of taking the IR laser point, because first I got to pattern the visible, and then I go pattern the IR, and I switch it back to the visible to make sure nothing switched or moved around from me toggling the switches, so I'm not inducing error. That's my confirmation. It was 147 degrees Fahrenheit at the time of taking that. So 177 had cooled down to 147, so still a little bit spicier. No shift whatsoever. So thermally, good to go. And I do want to reiterate that the switches, everything are working. Now, on that note, and it's kind of related to thermal testing, so what we actually did is we put a different unit on a select fire platform. If you want to see that video, it's on my Patreon. It is left as a free video in case you want to see the evidence firsthand. You can watch that. But we get the laser housing to 219 degrees Fahrenheit after 90 rounds, just absolutely dumped super fast. I would post it on YouTube if YouTube allowed that footage, but it no longer does. I think that pretty much covers what I've done so far to this unit to give you guys some data points, some things to consider, reliability aspects of this unit. So other than it physically showing some signs of use and abuse, this thing is built like a freaking tank, and that's where I can, in good conscience, based on what I've done to this unit, tell you it's a pretty solid choice for potential rugged use at the price point it comes in at. Now,